Hello, hello. This is kind of crazy because really I'm talking to nobody right now. I'm just talking to a screen. It's not like there's another person in the room or this is a live stream or anything like that. But I've been thinking about this idea of starting a podcast. Um, and this is a little different because most of the time a podcast is not a monologue like what you have right here, just me speaking. It's more of a dialogue, two or more people engaged in conversations, sometimes asking questions, interview format, storytelling, and who knows, we might evolve towards that eventually. I would definitely love to have other men kind of speak on some of the subjects that I want to dive into and bring the community into. But to start off, this is just going to be more of a monologue, more of a brain dump for me, an opportunity for me to process some emotions, some reflections on the past, hopes for the future, where I stand in this exact moment, which is arguably the hardest part, right? It's easy to talk back on what happened. It's not always easy to deal with the traumatic response that came with the past, but it's easy to at least talk about. We can project to the future that what we hope for and what we fear, but being real about the current reality is probably the hardest part for me personally. And that's the real heart behind this. So the concept behind this is going to be called the dark room. And if you are familiar with photography in any shape, way, or form, you understand that the dark room is where photos have to go to receive red light or to stay in the dark until they're ready to be revealed to the light so that they can go through the process of coming out and showing the true beauty of what else captured in that photo. And if light interferes in the dark room before it's ready, unfortunately, the photo is not developed properly. And in this season of life that I'm currently in, I'm sort of reflecting on how some areas of my life have not or did not develop as they should have, really as a result of lots of things. At this point in time, most of it are things that I'm taking responsibility for. But in my own responsibility, it does require me going a little bit deeper, thinking about some things from my past that might have been out of my control and how those things shaped the way that I sort of learned to behave as a young man, young adult, eventually a husband, father, just a man in general. So, in these conversations in the dark room, we're going to talk about a little bit of everything: the good, the bad, the ugly, some of the things that are sometimes off limits in some conversations because people just aren't really willing to speak on them. People aren't willing to address them. And most honestly, people aren't willing to be real. And I say people, really talking about myself, right? For a long time, there's so many things that I was afraid to really speak on, whether it was my past or my current situation or my fears. And that lack of willingness to address some of those things, it didn't just go away because I didn't speak on them. Things crept out through my actions. Things crept out through my lack of actions, sometimes being passive, dismissive, avoidant. And I believe it's time for me to really step in and embrace some of those things to become the man that I hope to be one day. I want to be very clear. I'm a believer in Jesus Christ. I do believe that God sent his only son to die on the cross for my sins. And it is for that reason that I'm here now and that I have hope for what the future might look like, not only in this life, but beyond this life. But as I admit to that, I also want to be clear that I don't have it all figured out, right? So in this conversation, I'm not going to talk Christianese jargon. I'm going to speak on faith. I'm going to refer to the word, but I'm going to be real and raw as a man who struggles, um, as a man who does not have it all together. I think there's enough podcasts, conversations, motivational speakers out there who present themselves as having the key to life figured out. And I know that because for a long time, I would say I fell in that category. A really long time, meaning 33 years. I'm still 33. I want to finally be real about the fact that I don't have it figured out, that I am a messed up person, but with the fundamental belief that my story's not over. I'm just right in the thick of it. I'm in some ugly chapters, but it's not over. So I don't want to just celebrate successes, although I do want to take the time to reflect on some of those successes and realize that I'm very thankful for the opportunities that I've been given. I also want to be real about some failures. I want to talk about some of the things that aren't so fun to talk about. I want to give space for other people to talk about some of the things that are not so fun to talk about. Because in that moment, that's the right representation of the dark room. That's where we get developed, shaped, molded. And that's kind of where I am, kind of sitting in some moments of failure and realizing that the only way out is through Jesus Christ and through Him really shaping me and molding me. I want to share a couple more things. I don't care about any kind of social media. I don't want to be on any kind of platforms where I'm getting likes. So you're going to find that there are no scripts to this conversation here. I'm recording this from a very generic laptop camera. I do not have a high definition microphone. I don't care about those things. So I'm really not doing this for the content to draw people in. I'm trying to create a space where I can be real with myself, reflecting on some things in life and having conversation. And eventually I want to invite other people in on that. So let's just make that clear. The goal is not to be a YouTuber or an influencer, any of that garbage. That's all empty. I just want to be real. I have a little bit of an idea of how I want to go about navigating this story for me personally. And I believe it'll eventually be topical, and there will be different conversations between myself and other men on things like marriage, divorce, parenting, success, failures, fears, insecurities, debt, wealth, faith, or what have you, just to name a few. But before we can get to that point, for me personally, I want to start this conversation out with probably a few series or subjects, titles, I should say, that fall under the scope of how do we get here. So, what I mean by that is I want to talk a little bit about what has brought me to a point where I want to have these conversations and I want to examine my heart and I want to take some of the things that I feel like are stuck up here and allow them to come out down here. I once had a counselor say to me, you get it, but you got to get it from your head to your heart. And that's the journey I'm on, and it's tough. So when I look back on, excuse me, again, I'm not editing that, just keeping it real. When I look back on how I got here, man, it's got to start in the childhood for me. Because I can look at some of the decisions that I made as a married man and as a father that I'm not proud of, but I recognize that that decision making was framed in a childhood where basic needs weren't met. And I want to be clear that my goal is not to sit here and make excuses, right? When you have caused pain, trauma, whatever it may be on someone else, you got to sit in and own up to that. So I own up to the fact that I was not the husband that I needed to be to Rachel, and that I haven't been the father that I aspire to be to Micah, Grace, Isaiah, and Adeline. I wouldn't dare make excuses for that. But what I am finding through my own counseling journey and through what God is choosing to reveal to me is that while they're not excuses, there's some explanations. There's some explanations that help me understand that basic needs being met in early childhood, adolescence, teenage years, and even early adulthood shaped the way that I saw the world, shaped the fact that I struggle to trust people and build authentic, deep relationships. It doesn't mean I can't engage with people and have relationships, but I mean deep, authentic relationships where people really know me and I really know them. Shaped my ability to believe that I could have a healthy relationship with a woman due to my primary caretaker, my mom, not being able to provide me with that security. Shaped the way that I saw myself as a father, never having the opportunity to have that model for me. shaped the way that I saw myself as a husband, never having the opportunity to have that model for me, and really put me in what is known as the escape cycle. So I've been in counseling for a few years. Okay, I've seen some good counselors, I've seen some bad counselors. I finally have a great counselor. I'd love to give a shout out to Mark. I can't imagine going through this current journey without him. Mark has helped me understand what's called the escape cycle, right? So when you are a healthy individual who has grown up in a house where you were nurtured and your emotions were responded to, you learn how to recognize what you're feeling when emotions come up. Second to learning how to recognize what you're feeling, you learn how to recognize how to respond to them. Okay? Unfortunately for me, nurturing was not a word on the vocabulary list that I would use to describe any of the homes I grew up in. When I was with my mom, um, when Child Protective Service removed us and we were in other homes, nurturing was never the word. And at some point in time, we'll probably dive into some of the specifics of what those homes entail. But long story short, neglect, physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, scarcity, basic needs not being met, uh, verbal abuse, drug addiction, drug use, substance abuse. All of those things were things that I considered normal growing up because I can't remember a time period where those things were not always right in front of me. Right? I remember one time in fifth grade, I had a friend come over to the apartment we stayed in, and he looked at me and was like, "Is your mom smoking weed?" And I was like, "Yeah, does your mom not?" Because I didn't know that weed was illegal because I'd always seen it, right? So as a kid, I really knew two emotions, happy and angry. What I knew about being happy was that there were certain things that brought me joy, but it almost seemed like you weren't allowed to be happy in the culture that I grew up in. You had to have kind of a stone cold survival of the fittest type mentality. And when I was angry, it was at the reality of our situation. And the only way that I knew how to express that was rage. Fighting, screaming, throwing things, crying. So while it wasn't permissible for me to be happy, it also wasn't acceptable for me to be angry. So you know what I learned? To show no emotion. I'm currently an elementary school administrator. I love my job. It's amazing. One time someone gave me a compliment and they said, "How do you stay so level headed all the time? You know, when we're in the middle of a conflict, you're right here." And my response to him was, I stay level headed because I grew up in chaos, right? So because it was always way up here, I learned I had to stay right here. I had to keep it cool. I had to fly under the radar because if you draw attention, you're going to bring negativity onto yourself. So while it's a benefit that I understand how to stay level headed, it also meant I didn't understand how to respond to my emotions as they came up. So back to the escape cycle. When you are taught how to properly recognize and respond to an emotion, you give that emotion what it needs. So let's say I'm extremely upset and I'm in grief over a loss. In a home where it's acceptable to express your emotions, you go through the full cycle of grief and you feel it and you learn to process it before you can accept it and move on in a healthy way. In the home that I grew up in, you take that emotion and you shut it down and cover it with something that's more comfortable. And this is where people become addicted to whatever it may be, a substance, um, a sexual release, working, physical fitness, their own looks, because they don't know how to recognize that emotion and not give it what it needs. So this escape cycle is really something that Mark's helping me understand through recognizing and giving time and attention to emotions as they should be. So to go back to 1992, I was born. My mother was 21 years old. She was on her third pregnancy at the time in New York City. She had been through a lot. She had been on her own since she was 13. So from 13 until she died, 35, it's only a 22-year span, she was on her own. And she learned how to survive using people as her resources because she did not have the assets of, I dare say, standard middle class individuals, but probably not even lower class individuals. Never owned a car. So as a kid, we didn't have a car. She did not have a driver's license, was not able to maintain a job. She had to learn to use herself, unfortunately, her body, but also her relationships to get her basic needs covered. And I'm at this odd place where I have so much more empathy towards my mother than I've ever had. You know, my emotions from about 10 years old till 33 were simply anger and resentment towards her because I felt like, how could she not care about her kids enough that drugs and men were more important, to the point where she allowed us to get taken by Child Protective Services? How could she? I mean, how much sense does that make? What I now understand is that my mother did not know how to properly identify and respond to her emotions. So she, a lot like myself, but in different ways, lived in the escape cycle. And the escape cycle for her was addiction, and drug addiction led to abuse, neglect, Child Protective Services taking her children, and eventually her death. So when she had me in 1992, we stayed in New York City for a few more years. And in 1996, she fled, wanted for a crime in New York City, to a small town called Christiansburg, Virginia. But she didn't take two of her three kids. She only took her oldest. And she left myself and my younger sister at the time. I was 4. My younger sister was 2.5, in New York. And this was really the beginning of me not understanding where my identity and security came. While I don't remember all the details of that period of time, being 4 years old, I do remember being reunited with my sister and my mom in 1996 and crying when I saw my sister get on the school bus because I thought that she was going to be gone again for an unforeseen period of time. Life was unstable, always. Between 1996 and 2003, when we were taken from her, I think I attended 8 different elementary schools between kindergarten and 4th grade. Finally, I went to the same school for a full year in 5th grade. It was the first time in my whole elementary school career that I attended the same school for the entire 10-month school year. But that was a result of instability. Because my mother struggled and lived in that escape cycle, more often than not, where we stayed was dictated by where her resources lied. We would get evicted. She would change boyfriends. And I remember, there would be times where I was sitting at one school on Friday, not knowing that that would be my last day at that school. I'd get home, find out we're leaving, and I'd be enrolled at another school by Monday. And this just became normal. Not knowing where the next meal was going to come from, not knowing where you were going to go to school, not knowing where you were going to lay your head that night. So very quickly, I learned to realize I can't show any kind of emotion. I can't get too attached to anything or anyone. And I really don't know where my identity lies. But I would say the most significant part of those 3 statements was the second. I can't get attached too closely to anything or anyone. Now, I want to pause on that for a second and acknowledge that that's a lie from Satan, but I want to be real and admit that that is so hard for me to get past. I still live there. I have a very hard time letting people truly know who I am. Some of the details I just shared regarding my upbringing, I didn't start sharing with people until I was 28, 29, 30 years old, right? I had 10, 15-year relationships with people who I would consider my friend, who I'd never really let in. I'd never told them the truth of what I'd endured. I'd never told them how I got to where I was. And it was truly only because I was getting into educational administration that I started to share some of that. But even in me beginning to share it, it was not really fully authentic. I wanted to share it because I realized there were some children who have similar situations and stories that I have. Either one or both parents absent, one or both parents deceased, in and out of foster care, a victim of physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse. And I wanted them to see, hey, you can be successful just like I'm successful. Look at me. I'm a school principal. You can do this too. But what I didn't see and recognize at the moment was that I had never actually addressed the trauma of some of the things I'd gone through. And because I had not taken the time to address that trauma, I was still acting in my heart like I was still in those situations. My outside circumstances looked very different than the trauma that I grew up in. I got married, owned a beautiful home, 4 amazing children, 2 boys, 2 girls, all about 18 months apart, 2 mini golden doodles. Just a picture of the American dream. Great job. But I was still broken inside, and I still am. And because I was broken inside, I still lived in the escape cycle. I still struggled to name my emotions and respond to my emotions. And when I felt them, I would escape. I would look for opportunities, things, people to distract me from really facing that reality. I'd make decisions that would eventually make me lose all of it. It's a tough pill to swallow because this is not me speaking in the past tense. This is reality. It's Sunday. My wife just told me on Friday, 2 days ago, that she wants the divorce. We've been separated about 6 months, but she finally told me straightforward, I want a divorce. And all I can do is accept that. The point of this episode is not to go into detail about how I feel about that. We can talk about that down the road. But it's important to understand the connection between those circumstances as a child, not addressing that trauma, and my current situation. So I gave you background on how I got to Virginia, my early school years. Now it's time to talk about some pivotal moments. First one is 2003. I'm in 5th grade. It's the middle of May. School year's almost over. And over the intercom in my 5th grade classroom, Christiansburg Elementary School, the secretary says, Miss Mashinsky, I need Sterling Harrison to ride bus 9 home to this address. Not an unusual announcement. Every now and then, I'd ride bus 9 home to Nana's house, because that's where my mom would be. Typical announcement, atypical day. CPS had decided they had plenty of evidence that my mother was guilty of abuse and neglect, and that would be the last time that we were under her care fully. At the time, my mother had 5 children. Her 2 youngest would have been 3, 4 years old, and she had already decided to give custody of them to their biological paternal grandmother. So she kept myself, my older sister, and a sister that's about 18 months, younger than me. That call from CPS got the three of us taken. We didn't know what was going on at first. It wasn't the first time that we weren't in her care. Unfortunately, she had been in and out of jail several times. So I didn't expect this to be a life-changing thing, but it was. A couple of days of not living with her turned into a couple of weeks. A couple of weeks turned into a couple of months. A couple of months turned into forever because a few years later, she was killed. So that's my second major. Third, how we got to Virginia. One major, childhood trauma. Second, CPS, abuse and neglect. Third, witnessing the death of my mother and having to identify her body in her hospital bed as she lay there dead. At this point, I'm 14 years old, right? 14, having gone through all those things. In addition to those three major moments in time, by 14, I'd also experienced sexual abuse. One of the perpetrators was my mother. I mentioned she struggled with drug addiction. And again, I've got a significant amount of empathy for her. I really do believe she did the best that she could, given the tools that she had and the lack of guidance that she was given from the generation before her. I didn't realize that my mother had sexually abused me until my wife and I had separated. Another one was an older friend of the family, sexually abused me around 9 years old. So I started to develop a very, very twisted way of viewing what it meant to be a man and what a healthy relationship with a woman looked like. Not really just because of the sexual abuse, but also because of the lack of the ability for us to have a well-regulated, normal, healthy attachment. These things would follow me into adulthood, right? The only thing about it is I became well polished at hiding it. I knew that I had some dysfunctional ways of thinking, but if they were below the surface and no one knew, it only affected me, right? It was wrong. It was wrong. And going back to what I mentioned earlier about not being able to engage in true, authentic relationships with other people put me in a situation where I lacked accountability. So you take lacking accountability and you take dysfunctional views of relationships with women, and you got a recipe for a bumpy marriage. This is going to be deep. It's going to be real deep. So, went to college, just about dropped out because my goal was only to go to college. No man in my family had ever went. So if you went, you made it, right? It wasn't about graduating. You went to college. But then I got there and was like, this is not that hard. If you show up to class and you do your work, you'll probably get a degree. Yeah, we'll stick around and maybe I'll get a degree, maybe I won't. And about my third year in, I started working a ton at a local restaurant. They made me a manager. And I thought, well, why do I need to go to college if I'm already making a little bit of money? So I started getting to the point where I was working 50, 60 hours a week. But then God kind of slapped me and said, you're at college to learn and you're working to pay for that. But really what you're doing is working and not going to class. So what are you looking to work towards? Do you want to spend the next 30 or 40 years working at a restaurant? Or do you want to use this to gain leadership experience, customer service experience, people skills, work ethic, punctuality towards an actual career? So I decided to quit working at that restaurant and finish my degree. But in that window of time where I decided to quit and finish my degree, I started dating a young lady who had experienced the things in life that I'd never experienced. She understood financial wisdom. She understood spirituality. She understood the hidden rules of the middle class. And that's a whole other topic of conversation that I'll get into in another conversation. It's not time for that, but people have to understand there are some rules in the middle class that you just don't know if you grow up in the bottom. You don't know. And because you don't know them, by the time you find out, it's typically too late. It truly is. So this girl was really showing me the path. And I fell in love with her. We got married. We had 4 kids. She didn't realize she was marrying trauma. She knew my story. I don't think she understood the trauma. And I didn't realize the impact that the trauma was going to have on our relationship. I have listened to this audiobook probably 3 or 4 times recently called What Happened to You. It's narrated by Oprah Winfrey and written, co-authored by Dr. Perry, and it's all about understanding childhood trauma and how it affects the way that we think as adults. One of the most significant takeaways that I have had from that book is a point about if you don't have your basic needs met as a child, you'll never truly be able to trust the relationships that you have. And when you experience a good relationship, either directly or indirectly, or intentionally and not or not intentionally, you will self-sabotage because you operate and find comfort in dysfunction. I know it sounds crazy, but that's exactly what happened. So it's going to take some time of going back and peeling through this onion. There's a lot that needs to be discussed, discovered, uncovered in order for me to be the man that I truly believe God's called me to be. And the reason that I am recording this monologue, again, the idea is eventually a podcast, again, self-titled The Dark Room. Right now, I just need to dump my brain. I just need to dump my brain out, share my thoughts, get it all out, and start processing some information. And what I do with that information is really up to me. It can go one of 2 ways. These thoughts can either become constructive, and I can start to use them to build myself up, to build others up, or they can remain destructive, and they can start to become what I allow to take me down an even darker path. Man, it's going to be a journey. It's going to be a real journey. But I'm excited because I believe that there is a calling on my life. Again, shout out to Mark, my counselor. I believe there's a calling on my life to influence young men. And I think that people are more influenced when they can bond over what's real and they can share each other's struggles and failures. And again, my goal is not to be an influencer on YouTube, Instagram. I don't give a rip about that. But I do believe that people would rather follow somebody who's real than someone who's always right. So for the first time in 33 years, I'm ready to be real with myself. I'm ready to take a look at the pain that people have caused me and how I allowed it to lead to me causing other people pain. I'm ready to take a look at the character flaws that I developed, some completely unbeknownst to me. I'm ready to peel back some of the layers of the onion to recognize where I allow myself to fall into the escape cycle. I'm ready to truly carry out what it means to forgive my mother for her abuse and neglect, and my father for his lack of presence. These are two things I've been working on for years. I mean, a really long time. But I have so much more empathy, A, being a father, and B, being in a situation and circumstance where I don't have the freedom to spend the amount of time with my children that I want to. Um, Man, it's been a great monologue. It feels good to get some thoughts out. Whole lot more to come. Good, bad, ugly. Thanks for listening.